Well, good morning. Thank you for working with us as we change pace yet again, working with the Purple Book. As I've talked with people about the way that we conduct the service, it may seem to you that it's important to me that we craft this worship together. I say it may seem to you that it's important to me because it's actually an Anglican thing, that we craft our worship together. It's in the 39 Articles, that our worship would be understandable. It's at the core of Anglican practice and polity. So I encourage you to speak with me, to reflect with me on the nature of our worship, to help me to work with you to craft worship that engages us, that causes us to walk as disciples and to follow Jesus more carefully. As we talk about following as disciples, I draw your attention to the change in the decor. We've changed to green, and that's the last change we're going to have for a minute. We've got a lot of green weeks coming up, and as you see on my stole, am I allowed to call it a stole in Sydney? I don't know. Yeah. You'll see that this design that was designed by my friend Elverina in Yarrabah in North Queensland and sewed by Alison depicts people walking to the cross, people with different coloured footprints, which is of course ridiculous because we all leave the same coloured footprints. But the invitation is for us to walk toward the cross with people coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different skin colours. And this week, as we reflect on Refugee Week, I encourage you to think about ways that we might engage with people whose culture is fresh and new and for whom our culture is strange and alien. This week, our readings invite us to consider how we walk together with people who struggle. And both Barbara and I have mentioned the idea that our discipleship can take the form of reflecting on our relationship up in to our personal life and outwards in our journey with those around us. Our stories today invite us in those three directions, in, out, and up. In the story from the Old Testament, which is 1 Kings, not 2 Kings, as it mentions there, we find the prophet Elijah after his great moment of conflict and triumph. He had the big showdown up on the mountain, and he was in full flight. I don't know if you've ever had those moments where you went, yeah, this is it, this is me on fire. This was him on fire. He was laying into the prophets of Baal. He was taunting them. Where is your God? Is he gone to the toilet? Oh, who could imagine what God would do if you were here cutting yourselves up and hurting yourselves in order to get his attention, but still he's not here. He's doing all of this taunting in the face of certain death if they get a hold of him. And yet his God comes through, sets everything spectacularly alight, burning up everything, the water, the sacrifices, the altar itself, and all of the prophets of Baal are put to the sword. It seems strange then that he might run away into the desert, overwhelmed, even in fact whining to God, woe is me, I'm the only one left. You'll be glad to know that God doesn't take that on the chin, that in the gap between the parts of the reading that we read, between verse 4 and 8, God says, psst, you think you're the only one? There are 7,000 more like you, more faithful, who would stand for me and speak my word. But even so, God takes care of him. God takes care of him in that time when he is alone and worn out and full of self-doubt and foreboding. And rightly so. Jezebel has it in for him big time. She owned the franchise on the prophets of Baal, and she was the one who wielded power through them. And that their power was taken away was a great affront to her. And you see how Ahab goes crawling back to Jezebel saying, "I can't believe it, he pulled it all apart." Jezebel's wrath is felt right across the land as she reverberates in anger and vows with fury that she's going to cause Elijah to experience the same outcome as the prophets that she had put forward. How does God meet Elijah in that time? Does he meet him with more power? Irrefutably asserting his presence, saying, "I'm here and I'm in charge and it's all going to go my way from now on"? No. Elijah doesn't see God in the great wind so strong it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks to pieces. Elijah doesn't see God in the earthquake, splitting the very earth. Elijah doesn't see God in the fire. Now, if you take notice of these things, you'll notice that wind takes time to build up and go down, that earthquakes come and go, and that fire takes a moment to kindle and then burn out. So if you would consider with me that in those couple of verses, Elijah has been sitting there for a moment, taking time. Because sometimes it requires of us the discipline of silence to hear God's presence. Our lives are so busy, so full of the clamour of busyness and urgency. It is easy for us to be overcome by that and fail to hear the voice in the quiet. Finally, God asks Elijah again, "What do you want? Why are you here, Elijah?" The question comes to us. What do you want? As we're crafting our worship together, why are you here? What are you looking for? Do you expect to find it in the practices on Sunday morning? In the hymns? In the prayers? In communion? In the familiarity of our gathering together and practicing our worship of God? Or maybe you're looking for it in the connection that we find over morning tea. When Walter Wink talks about the powers, he suggests that there's a number of different ways that the demonic makes itself present. And one of those things is an internal possession of demons, and we see that in the story of the demoniac in the Gerasenes. But he also notices, as I have hanging out with charismatics for some years and seeing people being prayed for the release from demonic activity, some of those things, those experiences, he says, are unresolved internal conflicts. They're gifts that we have that have been suppressed or redirected, and so become burdensome or painful or chaotic or troublesome in our lives. on Sunday mornings, I just come and I hang out with you. But there's something about Sunday mornings that really exhausts me. I get to the end of the morning and I go and sit in my chair in the lounge room, and quite often I fall asleep. Sometimes it's because of the pain of standing upright. Sometimes it's because I spend myself giving to you during the sermon. But I need to address whatever's going on for me that exhausts me so that I can be fully present to you and also fully present to God. At the end of giving out during a sermon or some other activity, often when I play music, I'll get to the end of it and go, oh, that was terrible. I had an exam on Thursday. It was almost assumed by me that I'd get to the end of it and go, oh, that was terrible. It may be true. I won't get the results for 3 weeks. But have you ever had that experience where you pour yourself into something and you get to the end and you're empty and therefore defenseless against your own negative self-talk and find yourself beating yourself up? Logically, it should have been for Elijah that he went, yeah, God, we've got this, and stood his ground and said, I don't care what you throw at me, Jezebel. My God is bigger and better and stronger and wiser and loves me and won't let me be taken down by you. But instead of that, he runs for days and days into the desert and sits mournfully and succumbs to his negative self-talk until God meets him and says, what do you want? We come to the psalm, and as is the case for about a third of the psalms, one day, Isabel, we're going to have to get the organ lined up with some decent guitar riffs and play some real blues for one of these psalms. The psalms are written to music. They're written for music, and several of the psalms, I would judge about a third, are written in the form of the blues. As we read this psalm, we hear someone struggling and yearning for things to come together for them. They're struggling because things aren't going well. They're struggling because they feel alone. In the silence, when we go looking for God, we will often feel the aloneness of the emptiness of the silence. In the King's reading, we see that after the fire, a sound of sheer silence was where God was. And we can find that space frightening. The thing about lament, for that is what it is, the thing about lament is if you spend it willy-nilly, you become a whiner. I hear myself whining when I'm complaining about something because I'm not spending my lament in the right direction. I'm frittering it away pointlessly, and because I'm not spending it in the right direction, it doesn't yield me any benefit. All I do is reinforce my feeling of helplessness and woe. Powerful lament is spent in the direction that can change things. The psalmist, by acknowledging God as being the source of his well-being and the one who can change the way things are, the psalmist says, I know how to fix this. I know where my help is found. I know what to do about it. It's been quite often said to me, I don't want to bother God with my problems. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. The idea that I don't want to bother God comes from an idea that God is so small that it would be too much for God to handle. But if God called me to himself and then called me out, then surely it's God's job to sort out the stuff on the way. It's an old Jewish tradition, and I don't remember if I mentioned it to you before, but the movie The Brothers, about a Second World War pair of brothers who are Jewish, retreat to the Black Forest, one with a band of guerrillas fighting the Germans, and the other gathering all of the people who are waifs and strays fleeing from German oppression. The two brothers get together from time to time, and at one stage they're under fire and everything is going wrong, and the Germans are onto them and they're sweeping the forest to try and find them. And the rabbi in their midst rails against God. How dare you? You call us your God? Look at us. We don't want to be your people anymore. It seemed like a great idea. But look where it's got us. Is your God big enough for that sort of robust conversation? I think God delights in it. The prayer that's always answered in the Old Testament is when the people cry out. The people cried out to God and God heard and answered. This is the cry out. God, what are you doing? I don't understand. This is how we go from being whining to lamenting. It's all about the direction. The one who can do something about it is the one we need to direct our questions to. Finally, our story about the demoniac in the Gerasenes. This story is loaded up, and it is a full 2-hour Bible study in previous time, but I want to just touch some main things. Firstly, that it's outside. So Jesus always finds in Mark and often in Luke, will find real discipleship outside Jerusalem, outside Judea, outside the place where you would expect to find real disciples. He goes outside to the most outside place. Remember, Jews don't like being unclean because it cuts them off from God. And yet here is Jesus outside the chosen land, the promised land, hanging out with a demoniac in a graveyard with a bunch of pigs. This is as unclean as you can get. He's far away from God as you can get. Now, there are some markers in this story that tell us some more about the detail. Using the word legion is not just a number. It's a reference to the Roman occupation. And for the Gerasenes, the people in the 10 cities, the Decapolis, they were overrun by Rome and then the Jews and then by Rome again. They were overrun. And having Jesus come into their midst was a problem because he brought attention. He was a Jew, and then attacking their means of survival, their economic foundation for the area. I don't know if you've seen a herd of 1,000 pigs recently, but that's a lot of pigs. And those pigs are floating in the water now. Any reason why you think people might shoo Jesus away? Before you destroy anything more of the economic foundation of our lives, could you please go somewhere else? Destroy their life. We find in the demoniac, going back again to Walter Wink, we find the possibility that Luke is suggesting that this person is like the scapegoat. In Old Testament times, the scapegoat was the one who was, all of the sin of the community was put on this scapegoat, and they were chained up outside and sacrificed for the sake of the well-being of the people. I think it was Gamaliel suggested that Jesus was an appropriate scapegoat. Better that one should die for the benefit of all of the people. For the Gerasenes, so Wink suggests, having this guy being unwell helps them to feel better about who they are. And in fact, by labelling him with that, they pour out all of their fears and anxieties and unwellness, their vulnerabilities on this guy. So he suggests that that's another reason for them wanting Jesus to go away, because now that we've lost our scapegoat, who's going to be the fault? Who's going to be to blame for things not going right? As a society, we do this. You see it in wave after wave of immigration, and the last in is the most derided. We see it in the names that we use to describe people and the way that we treat them. Waves of Vietnamese people come in, fleeing from war, and we give them a name and we push them away. Waves of Europeans come in after the war, and we give them a name and we push them away. We deride their food and their smell and their behaviour, their cultural practices, and we use those things to push them away from us. We make them the fault for everything that's gone wrong. That's what Hitler did with the Jews during the Second World War. He said, they're the problem, destroy them and everything will be good. It's a cheap trick. It distracts people. And we've done it with refugees for much too long. When Jesus heals this man, he instantly responds in his right mind, sitting at Jesus' feet. In the same way that Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel, this man immediately submitted himself to Jesus and his teaching, and he wanted to follow him. But Jesus, instead of saying, come and follow me, learn how it is to be a disciple and then you can go and do it. No, Jesus says go and commissions him, sends him out as a missionary, perhaps the first apostle. What does that tell us? Well, firstly, that we don't need theological training or 3 years of Greek to tell the good news about what Jesus has done in our life. You get to tell your stories as you find them, and they're best told fresh. Not just for the person in front of you, but for you, for me. It's good for me to tell the stories of how God has worked in my life because it reminds me, and it more deeply embeds it in my life and my practice and my psyche, so that I don't have to go running off into the desert every time I've done something to try and find my equilibrium again. It is certain that demonic infestation still happens by my experience, by the experience of people around the world. But it is also true that we allow things to happen that demonically implicate us. The way that refugees are treated by Australians is a government policy, but is our name that they're doing it in. The Gospels are very political, and if you think that it's just John or just Jeff or just Byron or just anyone who's spoken here in the past that is political, read the text. Read the text. If this story was using Hebrew numbers for images of many demons, they would have said 40. But instead they said legion. It's a political statement. We need to acknowledge the political acts that are being done in our name and name them. Sometimes that's the only prophetic act that's called from us, to name it. Sometimes we need to name it again and again. Sometimes, in order to make sure that we don't succumb to the cultural torture that is being wielded by our culture on another, we need to keep acting out that prophetic statement so that we would remain free, so that we would refuse to align ourselves with that line of thinking and that way of behaving. These green weeks of ordinary Sundays, I think, are better called the weeks after Pentecost, because these are the weeks where we reflect on what it's like to be disciples of Jesus. To reflect on the ways that the gifts that God has given us have been suppressed and turned into negative influences in our life. To reflect on who the right one is to send our lament to, and to name the things that are going wrong, and to expect transformation and to look for change. And to acknowledge that our mission outside has many directions and many acts that we can do, and each of us have things that have been planted in our hearts that we are passionate about. I am passionate about you exploring those and pursuing those, and I will support you every step of the way. If that support is a robust conversation, then we should have it. If that support is standing alongside you in a picket, then we should do it. If it's raising awareness, let's learn. And in the meantime, as we look at our life as disciples, as we look at our life inwardly, up towards God and out to our neighbour, let us seek the power of the Holy Spirit to guide us, not doing everything so that we're worn out, but rather doing what we're called to with the gifts that we've been given so that we might be good news to those around us. We might embody the gospel to them. Amen.